Some ancient structures appear to defy our familiar norms, not because they break them, but because we may not fully understand them yet. Here on Made for Sleep, we slow things down and spend time with questions like these. Tonight, we'll drift through ancient stone structures that appear to defy modern laws of physics, looking not for answers, but for the quiet details that have endured. It's a story drawn from history, carefully gathered and shaped by our team into something calmer and easier to follow. Now, let the rain settle softly in the background, and if you feel like it, tell me how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. You stand in a landscape that has witnessed the passage of centuries, where monumental stones rise from the earth like silent guardians of forgotten knowledge. The wind carries whispers of methods lost to time, of human hands that shaped rock without the roar of machines, and of structures so precisely built that modern observers initially refused to believe ancient peoples could have achieved them without help from forces beyond this world. Tonight, you will walk among these stones and discover not mystery but remarkable human ingenuity. The morning sun hits the quarry face at an angle that makes the pink granite glow like heated copper. You run your hand along the surface where someone once worked, feeling the subtle texture left by tools that predate the concept of steel. The stone is cool despite the warmth of the day, and your fingers trace shallow grooves that spiral across the rock in patterns that seem random until you step back and see the intention behind them. Around you, the landscape tells a story that unfolds in layers. Scattered across the quarry floor are stone hammers, some as small as your fist, others requiring both hands to lift. They lie where workers left them, perhaps at the end of a shift, perhaps when someone called out that the block was finally free. The hammers themselves are works of careful selection. Each one is made from dolerite, a stone harder than granite, shaped by hands that understood the relationship between density, weight, and this stubborn nature of rock. You kneel beside one of the larger hammers and lift it. The weight surprises you, even though you expected it. This is not a tool for delicate work. This is an instrument of patience, designed for the kind of labour that measures progress in weeks rather than hours. The surface of the hammer shows patterns where it struck granite thousands upon thousands of times, each impact removing fragments so small you would need to collect them in handfuls to feel their weight. The unfinished obelisk still rests in the quarry bed nearby, a monument to ambition that encountered unexpected obstacles. It stretches nearly 70 cubits in length, which you mentally convert to roughly 40 metres, because your mind works in modern measurements, even when contemplating ancient achievements. The obelisk remains attached to the bedrock along one side, held fast by a crack that appeared during the final stages of extraction. You can see where workers noticed the flaw, how they stopped immediately rather than risk the months of labour already invested. Walking along the length of the unfinished monument, you notice channels carved into the surrounding rock. These trenches are narrow, barely wide enough for a person to stand in, but they run deep. Workers created these spaces by pounding the granite with their dolerite hammers, hour after hour, day after day, removing the stone in a process that modern engineers initially dismissed as impossible. The mathematics seemed wrong. Contemporary experiments suggested it would take decades to carve trenches this deep using stone on stone. Then someone actually tried it. The experiment took place with volunteers who agreed to work in shifts, using replica tools made to match the ancient designs. What researchers discovered was that technique mattered more than they had anticipated. The angle of impact, the rhythm of strikes, the use of water to both cool the stone and wash away granite dust. These variables combined to make the process significantly faster than theoretical calculations suggested. Workers who found their rhythm could maintain a steady pace for hours, the repetitive motion becoming almost meditative. You imagine the sound of it, not the irregular clanging that comes from random strikes, but a percussion that follows a pattern. Multiple workers spread along the trench, each one contributing to a rhythm that echoes off the quarry walls. The newest workers start off beat, self-conscious about their timing, but gradually they sync with the others. The combined sound creates a pulse that marks the passage of time more reliably than any water clock. The granite itself cooperates in ways that are not immediately obvious. When you pound the surface repeatedly in the same area, microscopic fractures begin to develop in the crystalline structure. These tiny fissures spread beneath the surface, invisible to the eye but present nonetheless. After sufficient pounding, a worker can pry loose a sheet of granite that is surprisingly thin, revealing fresh stone beneath. The process then begins again, layer after layer, until the trench reaches the desired depth. Someone brings you water in a clay vessel that matches designs found in archaeological contexts. You drink, and the water tastes mineral-rich, slightly gritty, exactly how you would expect water to taste after sitting in unglazed pottery. The person who brings it does not speak, but nods toward the sun, which has climbed higher while you are focused on the stones. Time behaves strangely in quarries. You can lose hours examining textures and patterns, each one a sentence in a larger narrative about human persistence. The question that modern observers asked for decades was not whether ancient workers could extract these massive stones. The physical evidence proved they did. The question was why anyone would choose this method when it required such extraordinary effort. The answer lies partly in available technology, but more importantly in the cultural relationship with time and labour. You walk to an area where extraction was successful. The rectangular cavity in the bedrock shows exactly where a stone block once rested. The sides of this cavity are smooth and perpendicular, meeting at corners that form precise right angles. Achieving this level of accuracy without metal saws or precision measuring instruments seemed to defy explanation until researchers examined the process more carefully. Workers began by marking the outline of the desired block using red ochre, a pigment that shows up clearly against pink granite. They checked their measurements by using knotted ropes, which served as standardized units. The knots were spaced at intervals matching the royal cubit, a measurement based on the length from elbow to fingertip of whoever established the standard. Once the outline was established, workers carved shallow starter trenches around all four sides, creating a guide that would keep the deeper excavation aligned. The trenches deepened in stages. Workers moved systematically around the perimeter, keeping the depth relatively even. This prevented stress fractures that might develop if one side went too deep, while others remained shallow. As the trenches descended, workers inserted wooden wedges into holes drilled along the bottom edge of the developing block. When water was poured over these wedges, the wood expanded, creating pressure that encouraged the granite to separate along the natural grain. But this wedge technique, while important, was not the primary method of extraction. That honour belongs to the patient percussion work, the endless pounding that gradually freed the stone from its matrix. The wedges merely assisted in the final separation, providing controlled force at strategic points. You sit on a stone that was extracted centuries ago, running your hands over its surface. The texture under your palms is smooth in some areas, rough in others, revealing where different processes were applied. This particular block never made it to its intended destination. Perhaps it cracked during transport, or perhaps plans changed and it became surplus to requirements. Now it serves as an inadvertent bench, supporting your weight while you contemplate the intersection of ambition and stone. The late afternoon light shifts, creating shadows that emphasize every irregularity in the quarry walls. You notice that some surfaces show a different character of tooling, indicating multiple generations of workers. Earlier marks are weathered, their edges softened by centuries of exposure. Later marks remain crisp, almost fresh-looking, as if the workers set down their tools only recently. This layering of effort across time creates a three-dimensional record more detailed than most written accounts. A bird lands on top of the unfinished obelisk, completely unconcerned with the historical significance of its perch. It preens for a moment, then flies off, and you find yourself smiling at the reminder that these stones exist in a world that continues, indifferent to human interpretations of ancient achievements. The granite does not care whether modern observers believe it could be carved with stone tools. The granite simply records in its surface the evidence of what actually occurred. The massive stone block sits on wooden rollers, and you're absolutely certain it should not be movable. Your brain performs quick calculations based on the block's visible dimensions and the known density of limestone. Even being conservative with the estimates, this piece of stone weighs at least as much as a loaded freight truck. Yet the rope in your hands is attached to this monument, and you're about to participate in an experiment that will either validate or demolish several theories about ancient transport methods. Around you, other volunteers take their positions along the rope. There are perhaps 40 people in total, which seems absurdly insufficient for the task ahead. The expedition leader, who has spent 15 years researching ancient construction techniques, walks along the line making small adjustments. She moves one person slightly forward, another slightly back, explaining that distribution matters more than raw numbers. The limestone block in question, is not actually ancient. It is a modern replica carved to match the dimensions and weight of stones used in temple construction thousands of years ago. The rollers beneath it are cedar logs, 6 of them arranged parallel to each other, each one stripped of bark and smoothed to reduce friction. The path ahead has been prepared by levelling the ground and laying down a track of wooden planks, creating a surface that is flatter than the surrounding terrain. Someone calls out a rhythmic chant, something simple that coordinates effort. On the second repetition, everyone pulls together and you feel the rope go taut in your hands. The block does not move. You pull harder, leaning back against the resistance, and still nothing happens. Just when you begin to suspect that this entire exercise is doomed to fail, something shifts. The block slides forward perhaps the width of your hand, the motion accompanied by a grinding sound that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. The realization that follows is both exhilarating and humbling. The block is moving, but barely, and it requires the sustained effort of 40 people to achieve this minimal progress. Extrapolating from this experience to the massive stones moved during ancient construction projects boggles the mind. Some of those blocks weighed 10 times what you are currently moving. Some weighed 50 times as much. The largest documented stones moved in antiquity weighed more than 1,000 tons, a number so large it becomes abstract. You adjust your grip on the rope and pull again. The rhythm becomes important. If everyone pulls in a steady, coordinated pattern, the block maintains momentum. When the coordination breaks down, when someone pulls out of sync, the block stops and must be started again from static friction, which is significantly higher than kinetic friction. This fundamental principle of physics becomes viscerally clear when you're on the rope, feeling how much easier it is to keep something moving than to start it moving. The wooden rollers beneath the block serve multiple purposes. Obviously they reduce friction by changing sliding motion into rolling motion, but they also raise the block slightly above the ground, creating clearance that prevents the stone from catching on irregularities in the terrain. As the block moves forward and the rear rollers emerge from underneath, workers retrieve them and carry them forward to the front, creating a continuously recycling path. This technique requires additional labour but eliminates the need for hundreds of rollers. After 30 minutes of sustained effort, the block has travelled perhaps 20 metres. Everyone is breathing hard. Hands are developing blisters despite the canvas gloves provided for the experiment. The expedition leader calls for a break and people immediately sit down, not bothering to find comfortable spots, simply dropping where they stand. You remain on your feet, walking around the block to examine how the rollers have held up under the strain. 2 of the cedar logs show compression marks where the limestone has pressed into the wood. The marks are shallow but clearly visible, and you run your finger along one, feeling the indentation. This damage will worsen over time, eventually requiring the replacement of these particular rollers. In ancient contexts, workers would need to maintain a supply of suitable logs, selecting trees of specific dimensions and wood density. The logistics of this supply chain, while less dramatic than the actual stone moving, would have been equally important to project success. Someone mentions ramps, and a discussion develops about the various theories regarding how massive stones were raised to heights necessary for temple construction. The expedition leader joins the conversation, and you listen as she methodically demolishes several popular misconceptions. No, there is no evidence for alien intervention, and anyone seriously proposing such theories should consider why they find it easier to believe in extraterrestrial construction workers than in human ingenuity applied over sufficient time. No, there is no lost anti-gravity technology, because if such technology existed, we would find evidence of its development in the archaeological record, not just in its supposed applications. What we do find, she continues, are ramps, many ramps. Some are straight ramps that approach structures at a single angle. Others are spiral ramps that wind around the perimeter of a growing monument. Still others are interior ramps built within the structure itself, later filled in or dismantled once construction reached completion. The specific design chosen depended on available space, materials, labour force size, and the particular requirements of each project. The break ends and everyone returns to the rope. Your hands have stiffened during the rest period, and gripping the coarse fibre causes immediate discomfort. You work your fingers a few times, restoring circulation, then take your position. The chant begins again, and the block slides forward, rollers creaking beneath its weight. As you pull, your mind wanders to the question of motivation. Why would anyone organise the labour necessary to move such massive stones? The practical answer involves durability and prestige. Larger stones mean fewer joints in a finished structure, which improves stability and longevity. Massive blocks also serve as unmistakable statements of organisational capability. Any society that can mobilise, feed and coordinate the labour necessary to move 1,000-ton stones is demonstrating power in a way that cannot be misinterpreted. But there is another dimension to consider. You are currently participating in extremely hard physical work that serves no practical purpose. This replica block is going nowhere important. It will not become part of a temple or tomb. Yet everyone on this rope is pulling with genuine effort, and there is something almost meditative about the shared struggle. The experience creates bonds between participants, a sense of collective achievement that persists, even though the achievement itself is temporary and essentially meaningless. Now multiply that feeling across years of work on a project that does have meaning. Imagine pulling ropes to move stones that will form the temple where your community gathers, or the tomb that will house a leader who brought prosperity, or the monument that marks your civilization's place in the cosmos. The work stops being merely labour and becomes participation in something larger than individual existence. The block encounters an irregularity in the track ahead. The front edge catches on a plank that has shifted slightly out of position. The entire procession stops while workers address the problem, using wooden levers to lift the block fractionally, while others adjust the offending plank. The fix takes 5 minutes, and then movement resumes. This small delay emphasises how crucial smooth tracks were for efficient stone transport. Any significant obstacles would require extensive problem solving and potentially major modifications to the route. You notice that the technique improves as the day progresses. People learn to anticipate the rhythm, to coordinate their effort without conscious thought. The chanting becomes less necessary as everyone internalizes the timing. This learning curve suggests that ancient work crews, who performed these tasks regularly rather than as one-time experiments, would have developed efficiency that far exceeded what temporary groups could achieve. The difference between novice and experienced stone movers might easily be a factor of 3 or 4 in terms of productivity. By late afternoon, the block has travelled perhaps 200 metres. This represents hours of sustained effort by 40 people, and the distance seems absurdly small relative to the energy expended. Yet when you do the mathematics, calculating how far this block could move in a month if workers pulled it 8 hours per day, the numbers become less impossible. A kilometre per month seems achievable, 3 kilometres over a season of work, 10 kilometres over the course of a year if the project maintained priority and adequate labour. The longest documented stone transport in antiquity covered approximately 900 kilometres. That particular project involved moving a monolith from a quarry to a temple site across terrain that included both water and land portions. The timeline for that transport remains uncertain, but estimates suggest somewhere between 1 and 3 years. Using the knowledge gained from modern experiments, those estimates seem entirely reasonable. Difficult, yes. Requiring massive organisational effort, absolutely, but not impossible, and certainly not requiring any technology beyond rope, wood, muscle, and time. The copper tool in your hand is surprisingly light. You expected more heft, some weight that would justify its reputation as the primary cutting implement for an entire civilization's stoneworking industry. Instead, you hold what feels like an oversized letter opener, its blade perhaps as long as your forearm, its edge worn smooth from use. The archaeologist supervising this demonstration explains that you are holding a reproduction based on tools found in workshop contexts, manufactured using period-appropriate metallurgy. Before you stretches a block of limestone that needs a channel carved across its surface. The channel will eventually house a wooden beam, part of a roofing system, but right now it exists only as an ochre line marked on stone. Your task is to create this channel using only the copper tool, water, and an abrasive mixture consisting of quartzite sand suspended in liquid. You dip the copper blade into the abrasive mixture, coating it thoroughly, then position the edge along the marked line. The archaeologist demonstrates the proper motion, a forward and back sawing that keeps constant pressure against the stone. You mimic the action, feeling the resistance as copper and abrasive meet limestone. The sensation is not what you anticipated. Instead of the sharp bite of metal cutting into rock, there is a grinding texture, a sense of material gradually wearing away rather than being sliced. After perhaps 50 strokes, you stop and examine your progress. A shallow scratch runs along the limestone where you have been working, maybe a millimetre deep, barely visible unless the light hits it at the correct angle. This tiny amount of progress represents several minutes of sustained effort. The channel you need to create is supposed to be several centimetres deep and wide enough to accommodate a beam. At your current rate of progress, completing this task would take days. The archaeologist nods when you mention this calculation. Yes, she confirms, days is exactly right. 4 to 6 days of work for a skilled craftsman to create one channel of the required dimensions. Multiply that by the number of channels needed for a single building, then multiply again by the number of buildings, and you begin to understand why construction timelines measured in decades were completely normal for major projects. She takes the copper tool from your hand and demonstrates a more effective technique. Her motion is smoother than yours, with less wasted energy. The angle of the blade against the stone is shallower, and she applies downward pressure primarily during the forward stroke, allowing the blade to ride lighter on the return. Most importantly, she maintains a rhythm that looks effortless, but probably represents hundreds of hours of practice. You watch her work for several minutes, noting the differences between her technique and your amateur attempt. When she hands the tool back, you try to incorporate the observations. The improvement is immediate. The blade bites slightly deeper into the limestone and the resistance feels different, less like you're fighting the stone and more like you are collaborating with it. Still, the progress remains slow by modern standards. A power tool could cut this channel in minutes. What you are doing will take days. The question that troubled researchers for years was whether copper, a relatively soft metal, could effectively work limestone, which is harder than copper on the Mohs scale. Early experiments using pure copper failed spectacularly. The tools deformed almost immediately, becoming useless within minutes. This led to various theories about lost techniques or harder alloys that somehow did not survive in the archaeological record. The actual answer turned out to be beautifully simple. The copper tool is not cutting the limestone. The abrasive mixture is doing the cutting, and the copper blade merely serves as a holder and guide for the abrasive. The quartzite sand is significantly harder than both copper and limestone, so it can grind away the stone while the softer copper blade wears down in a controlled fashion. As the blade wears, it can be resharpened, and ancient sites show clear evidence of dedicated blade sharpening areas. What makes this system particularly clever is that the wear rate of copper provides a self-limiting mechanism. If a worker presses too hard, the copper deforms and becomes ineffective, forcing a break to reshape the blade. This prevents the kind of damage that might occur from excessive force applied with a rigid steel tool. The softness of copper, initially perceived as a liability, actually becomes an advantage in a tool system designed for patience rather than speed. You continue sawing at the limestone, settling into a rhythm that feels sustainable. The motion becomes almost hypnotic, the repetitive action clearing your mind of other concerns. You understand why ancient craftsmen might have found this work meditative despite its tedious nature. There is something deeply satisfying about watching a channel gradually deepen under your sustained effort, seeing the physical manifestation of applied persistence. Around you, other volunteers work on similar tasks. One person is drilling a hole using a bow drill, another copper tool rotating at high speed with the same abrasive mixture providing the cutting action. Another volunteer is smoothing a stone surface using a rubbing stone, working in circular motions that gradually erase tool marks and create a polished finish. The combined sounds of these activities form a texture of human effort, a workshop atmosphere that must have been common in antiquity. Someone asks about granite, which is significantly harder than limestone. The archaeologist explains that granite requires different techniques. While copper tools with abrasives can work granite, the process is even slower than with limestone. For large-scale granite working, ancient craftsmen relied primarily on the pounding technique you observed at the quarry, using dolerite hammers to fracture and remove material. For fine detail work on granite, they used progressively finer abrasives, essentially polishing away stone in the same way you might polish a gemstone. The afternoon sun angles through the workshop space, highlighting suspended dust particles that have been liberated from the limestone. This dust is a constant companion in stoneworking, getting into everything, coating surfaces with a fine white powder. You notice it on your clothes, on your hands, in your hair. Ancient craftsmen must have breathed this dust constantly, which could not have been healthy. Evidence of respiratory problems has been found in skeletal remains from worker communities, a reminder that these monuments were built at genuine cost to human health. Your arms are tired now, the repetitive motion taking its toll on muscles not accustomed to this particular activity. You pause to rest, flexing your fingers and rolling your shoulders. The channel in the limestone has deepened noticeably, though it is still far from complete. You estimate you have removed perhaps a quarter of the material necessary to reach the required depth. At this rate, finishing the task would take another 10 to 12 hours of work. The archaeologist notices your fatigue and suggests a break. She brings you water and a piece of flatbread, both of which you accept gratefully. While you eat, she talks about the social organisation necessary for sustained stoneworking projects. Someone had to mine the copper, others had to collect and prepare the abrasive materials. Still others needed to quarry the limestone blocks and transport them to work areas. The actual carving represented only one component of a complex supply chain that required coordination across multiple crafts and locations. But the most interesting aspect, she suggests, is the knowledge transfer system. These techniques were not intuitive. They required training, practice, and accumulated wisdom passed from experienced craftsmen to apprentices. This created professional communities with specialized expertise, groups who possessed valuable knowledge that justified their social position. The relationship between the one who knows and the one who learns is ancient, predating written language, and it is embedded in every carefully carved channel and precisely drilled hole. You return to work on the limestone, incorporating everything you have learned. The motion feels more natural now, less like awkward imitation and more like emerging skill. You will never achieve the proficiency of an ancient craftsman who devoted years to perfecting these techniques, but you can at least glimpse the principles underlying their work. That understanding creates a connection across millennia, a recognition that the humans who built these monuments were neither more nor less than human, just differently equipped and differently motivated. The rope stretches from your hands to a distant stake, running perfectly straight across the levelled ground. You stand at the western end while someone else holds the eastern terminus, and between you lies the foundation for a structure that will eventually align with celestial phenomena. Right now, though, it is just a cleared rectangle on sandy soil with a few positioning stones marking corners. The architect, who has spent 2 decades studying ancient astronomical alignments, walks the length of the rope, checking its positioning. She makes minute adjustments using a plumb bob, ensuring the rope represents a true east-west line. This precision matters because the structure being laid out is designed to interact with sunlight in specific ways. On particular dates, sunlight will enter through one opening and illuminate another, marking key points in the seasonal cycle. You might assume this alignment requires sophisticated instruments, perhaps something comparable to modern theodolites or GPS systems. Instead, the architect uses methods that have been understood for millennia. The east-west line derives from solar observations, by marking the position where the sun rises on the eastern horizon and where it sets on the western horizon, then bisecting the angle between these points, you obtain a true east-west line. The process requires patience and clear weather, but involves no complex mathematics or specialized equipment. For the north-south alignment, the technique involves stellar observation. The architect explains that you would observe a circumpolar star, one that never sets below the horizon, making multiple observations throughout a night as the star rotates around the celestial pole. By marking the star's highest and lowest positions, then bisecting the angle between these points, you establish true north. Ancient observers identified specific stars for this purpose, creating celestial reference points that remained constant across generations. What strikes you as particularly elegant is how these techniques work anywhere on Earth. You do not need to know your latitude or longitude. You do not need maps or tables. You simply need clear skies, patience to make observations, and the mathematical knowledge to bisect angles. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia independently developed these methods because they flow naturally from careful observation of celestial mechanics. The foundation stones begin to arrive, carried by workers who transport them from a nearby staging area. Each stone has been selected for size and shape, intended to fit into a specific position within the structure. The architect checks each one, occasionally rejecting stones that do not meet requirements and sending them back. This quality control ensures that the finished structure will have the precision necessary for its astronomical functions. You help position one of the foundation stones, sliding it into place according to marks on the ground. The stone is heavy but manageable, roughly the size of a large suitcase. Once positioned, it needs to be leveled. This involves placing smaller stones underneath as shims, adjusting until a simple water level, a tube filled with liquid showing equal height at both ends, indicates the stone sits perfectly horizontal. The process repeats for each foundation stone. Position, shim, level, check, adjust if necessary. The work is methodical but not particularly difficult. What it requires is attention to detail and willingness to make incremental adjustments until everything aligns correctly. Rush the process, and the accumulated errors will compound, resulting in a structure that misses its astronomical targets. Take the necessary time, and the result will function as intended for centuries. While working, you ask the architect about theories that ancient structures demonstrate advanced knowledge that seems inexplicable for their time period. She sighs, and you sense you have touched on a source of frustration. The problem, she explains, is not that ancient peoples lacked sophistication. They were sophisticated, just differently sophisticated than modern cultures. Consider the concept of the solar year. Any agricultural society quickly learns that seasons follow a predictable pattern. By counting days between significant events, such as the longest day of summer, you can determine that the cycle takes approximately 365 days. This knowledge does not require advanced instruments. It requires paying attention and keeping records over multiple years. Once you understand the solar year, you can build structures that mark its passage. If you want sunlight to enter a chamber only on the summer solstice, you design the chamber's entrance to face the point on the horizon where the sun rises on that date. Then you construct the chamber with sufficient precision that the alignment remains accurate. This does not demonstrate secret knowledge or lost technology. It demonstrates patient observation and skilled construction. The architect shows you diagrams of various ancient structures with astronomical alignments. Some align with solstices, marking the extreme points of the sun's annual journey along the horizon. Others align with equinoxes, the two dates when day and night have equal length. Still others track lunar cycles, star positions, or planetary movements. The diversity of these alignments reflects different cultural priorities and different ways of organizing time. What these structures do not show, she emphasizes, is knowledge of things that should be impossible for ancient peoples to know. Occasionally, someone claims to find evidence that a structure encodes the speed of light or the exact diameter of Earth or some other value that requires modern scientific methods to determine. Detailed examination of these claims invariably reveals that they depend on selective measurement, creative interpretation of dimensions, or the use of modern rather than ancient unit systems. The actual alignments present in ancient structures are impressive enough without embellishment. You stand at a position marked on the ground and look toward where the entrance will eventually be built. On the summer solstice, sunlight will stream through that entrance at dawn, travelling down a corridor and illuminating a specific spot on the far wall. This will create a dramatic visual effect that reinforces the structure's ceremonial purpose. The precision required to achieve this effect is substantial, demanding careful calculation and skilled construction, but it is achievable using techniques available in antiquity. As afternoon transitions toward evening, you notice how the angle of sunlight shifts. The moving shadows cast by foundation stones create a natural sundial, marking the passage of time through visible changes in the landscape. Ancient peoples observed these same patterns, using them to organize daily activities and understand their place within larger cycles. The architecture they created externalized these observations, transforming them into permanent forms that could be shared across generations. The foundation work continues until the light begins to fail. The architect performs final checks using the last of the daylight, confirming that everything aligns as intended. Tomorrow, work will resume, building upward from these precisely positioned stones. The structure will grow slowly, each course of stones checked and leveled before the next is added. Eventually the walls will reach their planned height, the roof will be installed, and the chamber will be complete. You help gather tools as darkness settles. The rope that marked the east-west line is coiled and stored. The water level is drained and set aside. Foundation stones that remain unused are covered with cloth to protect them from moisture. These mundane tasks ground you in the practical reality of construction work. The astronomical alignments may be impressive, but achieving them requires the same careful attention to detail as any other building project. The hieroglyph you are attempting to carve into limestone has approximately 12 components, each one needing to be accurate in both proportion and position relative to the others. You hold a copper chisel in one hand and a wooden mallet in the other, and you are discovering that decorative stone carving requires a completely different skill set than the structural stonework you practiced earlier. The master carver supervising this exercise demonstrates the proper technique. The chisel contacts the stone at a shallow angle, and the mallet strikes with controlled force. Too soft, and the chisel merely bounces off the limestone without removing material. Too hard, and you risk fracturing the stone in unpredictable ways or driving the chisel too deep, creating gouges that ruin the design. The ideal impact removes a small chip of limestone exactly where intended, gradually defining the shape of the hieroglyph through accumulated removals. You try to replicate the demonstrated technique. The mallet strikes the chisel, which contacts the stone and removes a fragment. But the fragment does not come from quite where you intended, and the resulting mark is slightly off from your traced guideline. You adjust your aim and try again. This time, the mark lands closer to the intended position. Progress happens in tiny increments. Each chisel strikes a small bet that pays off, only if your aim is accurate. The hieroglyph you are carving represents a common word, something that appears frequently in temple inscriptions. The master carver chose it specifically because its form includes both curved and straight elements, testing different aspects of chisel control. The curved portions require you to adjust your angle continuously as you work around the arc. The straight portions demand consistency, maintaining the same angle and force across multiple strikes. After perhaps an hour of concentrated effort, you have completed about 1/3 of the hieroglyph. The carved portions are visible but crude compared to the smooth precision of ancient professional work. The master carver examines your progress and offers corrections. Your curves are too angular, composed of straight segments rather than flowing continuously. Your depth is inconsistent, deeper in some areas than others. These problems are typical for beginners but can be corrected with practice. She takes the chisel and mallet, demonstrating a particularly tricky curve that has been giving you trouble. Her hands move with practiced certainty, the chisel finding its mark with each strike. The curve develops smoothly under her tools, each chip removal advancing the form without creating jagged edges or irregular depths. Watching her work is simultaneously inspiring and humbling. The gap between novice and expert is vast. You resume carving, trying to incorporate the corrections. Focus on the angle of the chisel. Maintain consistent depth. Let the curve flow naturally rather than forcing it through discrete segments. The advice is simple to understand but difficult to implement. Your hands have not developed the muscle memory necessary for these motions. Each adjustment requires conscious thought, which disrupts the rhythm that experienced carvers achieve. The afternoon sun shifts, changing how light falls on the limestone surface. This alteration in illumination makes the carved portions stand out differently, revealing flaws that were not obvious under the previous lighting conditions. You notice areas where the surface is rougher than intended, places where the chisel removed material unevenly. These imperfections would need to be smoothed in a final finishing pass, using finer tools and abrasives to achieve the polished look of professional work. Around you, other students work on their own practice stones. Some are carving hieroglyphs, others are working on decorative borders, and a few are attempting more complex scenes involving human figures or animals. The sounds of mallet striking chisel create a percussion that fills the workshop, an industrial music that must have been constant in ancient carving facilities. The master carver explains that professional carvers in antiquity specialized in particular types of work. Some focused on hieroglyphic inscriptions, becoming expert at the standard forms and able to work quickly without sacrificing accuracy. Others specialized in relief scenes, developing skills in depicting human anatomy, drapery folds, and the countless details that bring carved narratives to life. The most skilled carvers might spend entire careers working on temples or tombs, contributing to projects that extended across decades. This specialization created quality hierarchies. Prominent locations received attention from master carvers whose work set standards for the entire project. Less visible areas might be carved by apprentices or less skilled workers, and careful examination of ancient structures reveals these quality variations. You can see the difference in how precisely hieroglyphs are formed, how smoothly surfaces are finished, and how well proportions are maintained. You pause to rest your arms, which are beginning to protest the repetitive striking motion. The mallet is not particularly heavy, but swinging it hundreds or thousands of times accumulates fatigue. The master carver mentions that professional carvers developed specific musculature, particularly in their dominant arm and shoulder. Skeletal remains of individuals identified as probable carvers through workshop contexts sometimes show these characteristic patterns of muscle development. When you resume carving, you notice that your technique has deteriorated during the break. The first several strikes land off target, requiring you to correct mistakes and remove more material than intended. Gradually you recover the rhythm you had developed before the rest period. This interruption recovery pattern suggests that ancient carvers likely worked in sustained sessions rather than starting and stopping frequently. Once you achieved a productive state of focus, it made sense to maintain it as long as physical endurance allowed. The hieroglyph is perhaps 2/3 complete now. The remaining portions include several details that concern you, particularly a section where multiple elements come close together without actually touching. Achieving the required precision seems unlikely given your current skill level. You mention this to the master carver, who examines the stone and concedes that this section will be challenging. However, she encourages you to attempt it anyway. The worst outcome is that you ruin this practice stone, which exists precisely for that purpose. You approach the difficult section methodically, working more slowly than before, checking your placement before each strike. The chisel removes material in the tiniest amounts, barely more than dust. This painstaking approach reduces the risk of error but dramatically slows progress. What you are discovering is that the final 10% of any carved element often takes as long as the first 90%, as tolerances tighten and room for error evaporates. The difficult section emerges gradually under your tools. It is not perfect, but it is recognizable, and importantly, you have not ruined the surrounding work. The master carver nods approval when she next checks your progress. For a first attempt, she says, this is acceptable. Not good, but acceptable. With several hundred more hours of practice, you might develop competence. With several thousand hours, you might achieve proficiency. This temporal investment explains why ancient carved structures are so impressive. You are looking at cumulative hours that measure in decades of skilled labour. A temple wall covered in hieroglyphs and relief scenes might represent 20 or 30 carvers working for 5 or 10 years. The dedication of that much specialised labour to decorative rather than practical purposes demonstrates cultural priorities and organisational capacity in ways that few other artefacts can match. The trilithon stands before you, its 2 vertical stones supporting a horizontal lintel that spans the gap between them. This particular example is scaled down from the massive structures found at certain ancient sites, but even at reduced size it represents a significant construction challenge. The lintel stone alone weighs approximately 2 tons, and somehow it needs to be raised to the top of the vertical stones and positioned precisely. The engineer directing this reconstruction project walks you through the planned approach. The vertical stones, called orthostats, are already in place, set into pits dug into the ground and backfilled with compacted earth and stone. They stand perhaps 3 meters tall, their tops relatively flat but not perfectly level. This is intentional. The lintel will need to be adjusted during placement, and having some irregularity in the surface actually makes this easier than if the tops were mirror smooth. The lintel currently rests on the ground nearby, positioned on a timber framework that keeps it elevated slightly above the dirt. This elevation allows the insertion of levers underneath, which will be the primary tools for raising the stone. The principle is simple, almost primitive, but mathematically sound. A lever multiplies force, allowing a person to lift weights that would be impossible to move through direct application of muscle power. You help position the first set of levers, sliding thick wooden beams under the lintel and setting them on fulcrum stones. The engineer emphasises the importance of fulcrum position. Too close to the load, and the mechanical advantage is minimal. Too far from the load, and you will need to push the lever through an impractical distance to achieve useful lift. The optimal position depends on the weight being lifted and the force available, but it generally sits about 1/4 to 1/3 of the way along the lever length from the load. Multiple people take positions at the ends of the levers. On a called signal, everyone pushes down. The far end of each lever rises, and because the lintel rests on these far ends, the stone rises as well. The lift is minimal, perhaps the width of 2 fingers, but it is enough. Workers immediately slide wooden blocks into the gap beneath the lintel, creating a new base that is slightly higher than before. The levers are repositioned on top of these blocks, and the process repeats. Lift, block, reposition. Lift, block, reposition. The rhythm becomes familiar quickly. Each cycle raises the lintel perhaps 5 or 6 centimeters. To reach the required height of 3 meters, you will need approximately 50 to 60 cycles. The mathematics is straightforward, but the physical reality is that each cycle requires coordinated effort from multiple people, and each cycle creates opportunities for things to go wrong. On the 8th cycle, one of the wooden blocks shifts as the lintel settles onto it. The stone tilts slightly, maybe 2 or 3 degrees off level, but this small variation is immediately noticeable and concerning. The engineer calls for a halt while workers assess the situation. The solution is to add additional blocking on the low side, bringing the lintel back to level before proceeding. This correction takes perhaps 10 minutes. A small delay in the overall timeline, but a crucial intervention that prevents the problem from compounding. As the lintel rises higher, new complications emerge. The levers need to be longer to maintain mechanical advantage, but longer levers are heavier and more awkward to position. The timber framework supporting the lintel becomes taller and more complex, requiring additional bracing to remain stable. Small errors in levelling become more obvious and more consequential. What began as a straightforward process gradually reveals its inherent complexity. You notice that the engineer constantly monitors not just the lintel, but also the vertical stone supporting it. These orthostats are set firmly in their pits, but the uneven forces generated during the lifting process could potentially shift them if the loading is not balanced. Workers adjust the position of levers and blocking to ensure that both orthostats receive similar loads, preventing differential movement that could destabilize the entire structure. The work continues through the morning and into early afternoon. By this point, the lintel has risen high enough that you need a ladder to reach the working level. Standing on this ladder while applying force to a lever creates a peculiar sensation. You are acutely aware of the potential energy stored in the raised stone, aware that if something fails, gravity will not hesitate to demonstrate its power. The safety briefing covered emergency procedures, but you hope they remain theoretical. At roughly 2 meters of elevation, the engineer calls for an extended break. Everyone is tired, and fatigue increases error risk. Workers eat, drink, and rest while the engineer inspects the setup, checking that all blocking is secure and all structural elements remain sound. She identifies a few pieces of blocking that have developed cracks under the sustained load and orders them replaced. This preventive maintenance might seem excessive, but it is exactly this kind of attention to detail that prevents catastrophic failures. The final meter of lift proceeds more slowly than the earlier stages. The lintel is now high enough that even small movements require significant effort. The blocking structure has become complex, a 3-dimensional puzzle of timber that supports the stone while allowing access for continued lifting. Workers must climb through this framework to position levers, a task requiring careful coordination to avoid disturbing elements that are bearing load. Finally, after approximately 8 hours of sustained effort, the lintel reaches its target height. It sits just above the tops of the 2 orthostats, supported by the elaborate timber framework. Now comes the delicate task of sliding it laterally from its current position onto the orthostats. This requires removing blocking on one side while maintaining support on the other, creating a controlled tilt that allows the stone to slide in the desired direction. The sliding process takes another hour. Every movement is incremental, checked and rechecked before proceeding to the next step. When the lintel finally rests entirely on the orthostats, with no support from the timber framework, there is a collective exhale. The structure is complete, at least in its basic form. Detail work remains, particularly adjusting the lintel's position to ensure it is level and properly centered, but the most challenging phase is finished. You stand back to view the completed trillathon from a distance. The structure is simple, just 3 stones arranged in a doorway configuration, but it has a presence that transcends its modest scale. The horizontal line of the lintel contrasts with the vertical lines of the orthostats, creating a geometry that feels balanced and intentional. This is architecture at its most fundamental, using gravity and friction to create stable forms from heavy materials. The engineer explains that ancient builders using these techniques could erect trillathons far larger than this demonstration structure. The principles scale, though the execution becomes increasingly challenging as mass increases. The largest known trillathons have lintels weighing over 50 tons, requiring lifting rigs far more substantial than what you use today. But the fundamental approach remains the same: patient application of lever mechanics, careful blocking, constant attention to balance and load distribution. You sit in a quiet room with stone fragments spread across the table before you. These are not impressive artifacts, they are debris, the broken pieces that accumulate during any construction project. Some show tool marks, others appear to be natural spalls that broke off during shaping, and a few might be waste from core drilling operations. To an untrained eye, this collection looks like gravel. To archaeologists, it represents a detailed record of ancient construction techniques. The lead researcher picks up one fragment and holds it to the light. This piece, she explains, comes from the interior of a core drilling, identifiable by the circular cross-section and the parallel scratches that spiral around its length. These scratches result from the rotation of a tubular drill, with abrasive material trapped between the drill and the stone doing the actual cutting. The pitch of the spiral indicates how far the drill advanced with each rotation, and this fragment suggests the drill was moving relatively quickly, completing perhaps one rotation per centimetre of depth. She sets down the core fragment and picks up another piece that shows different characteristics. This fragment displays a flat surface with parallel grooves running in one direction. The grooves are shallow and closely spaced, forming a texture rather than deep channels. This pattern indicates the use of a saw, probably a copper blade with abrasive mixture pulled repeatedly across the stone surface. The stone eventually fractured along its natural grain, producing this waste piece. What makes these fragments valuable is that they preserve evidence of processes that left no marks on finished structures. When ancient builders completed a temple or monument, they removed tool marks through polishing, creating surfaces that reveal nothing about how they were shaped. But the waste pieces that accumulated during construction show the intermediate steps, the scratches and grooves and fracture patterns that document actual working methods. The researcher shows you a controversy that has simmered in archaeological circles for decades. Some fragments from certain sites show marks that seem inconsistent with copper tools and abrasives. The grooves are deeper, the spacing is different, and the wear patterns do not match experimental results from replica tools. This led to speculation about unknown techniques or even non-human assistance, theories that continue to circulate despite problematic foundations. More recent analysis has revealed a simpler explanation. The unusual marks come from a later period when iron tools were available. Ancient sites were often reused, with later cultures modifying or expanding existing structures. The controversial fragments represent this later activity, rather than original construction. Once researchers accounted for the temporal mixing of artifacts, the supposed mystery dissolved, leaving only misidentified evidence from different historical periods. You pick up a fragment that shows what appears to be a failed attempt at drilling. The drill started at one point, then skipped to a new position perhaps a centimetre away, leaving a partial circle that was never completed. This error is strangely humanising. The worker who made this mark probably muttered something unflattering, repositioned the drill, and started fresh. That moment of frustration is preserved in stone, connecting you directly to the emotional experience of someone working millennia ago. The researcher mentions that analysing these waste fragments has revealed information about tool maintenance schedules. As cutting tools wear, the character of the marks they leave changes subtly. Fresh tools create narrow, clean grooves. Worn tools create broader, rougher marks. By examining multiple fragments from the same context, researchers can estimate how frequently tools were being replaced or resharpened. This provides insights into workshop organisation and the logistics of tool supply. Another category of fragments shows incomplete carvings, places where decorative work was started but not finished. One piece displays the outline of a hieroglyph traced in red ochre, with only the first few chisel marks made toward actually carving it. Perhaps the stone cracked and was discarded before carving progressed. Perhaps the design was rejected. Perhaps the worker was called away and never returned to this particular stone. The incomplete work captures process in a way that finished products cannot. You examine a piece that shows signs of recycling. One surface has tool marks from original construction work, but another surface shows different marks from later reuse. Ancient builders apparently salvaged broken pieces, reprocessing them for different purposes rather than always working from fresh stone. This recycling makes practical sense given the effort required to quarry and transport new material, but it complicates archaeological interpretation, because a single fragment might contain evidence from multiple time periods and projects. The researcher explains that one challenge in this field is distinguishing between marks that result from intentional shaping versus marks that occur through natural processes or post-depositional damage. Stone can fracture from thermal cycling, from freeze-thaw action, from root growth, from countless natural phenomena. Learning to recognize anthropogenic modifications requires training and experience. Even experts sometimes disagree about whether particular marks represent human activity or natural processes. She shows you a reference collection of fragments with known origins. Some were created using replica ancient tools as part of experimental archaeology projects. Others were collected from contexts where the construction methods are well documented historically. Still others represent natural fractures produced under controlled conditions. By comparing unknown fragments against this reference collection, researchers can make informed judgments about the processes that created them. One fragment is particularly instructive. It shows marks from 3 different processes: initial rough shaping using percussion, intermediate smoothing using coarse abrasives, and final polishing using fine abrasives. The transitions between these stages are visible on the fragment's surface, creating a record of the complete finishing sequence. This single piece provides more information about stoneworking technique than 100 finished surfaces where all evidence of process has been polished away. You spend time examining each fragment in the collection, training your eye to recognize the subtle differences between various tool marks. What initially appeared to be random scratches gradually resolves into patterns that tell stories about human effort and technique. The education happening in this quiet room with broken stone pieces feels as valuable as any lesson learned through hands-on reconstruction work. The researcher mentions that this analytical work continues, with new technologies enabling examinations that were impossible decades ago. Microscopic analysis reveals details invisible to the naked eye. 3D scanning documents surface topography with sub-millimeter precision. Chemical analysis identifies residues from organic materials that do not normally survive in archaeological contexts. Each technological advance provides new data, refining our understanding of how ancient peoples achieved their architectural accomplishments. She concludes by emphasizing that the story told by these fragments is ultimately one of human capability. Ancient builders did not have access to modern tools or modern knowledge, but they had intelligence, patience, and accumulated expertise. They observed physical principles even if they did not express them in mathematical equations. They developed techniques through trial and error, preserving successful methods and discarding failures. The monuments they created are impressive, but the fragments they left behind are educational. Evening light angles across the landscape as you stand before a structure that has survived for millennia. The stones show their age in weathered surfaces, in joints where mortar has eroded away, in the subtle settling that has occurred over countless generations. This architecture was never intended to look pristine. It was designed to endure, and endurance accepts the marks of time as inevitable. You run your hand along a stone surface that was carved flat thousands of years ago. The texture under your palm is rougher than it would have been when fresh. Wind-driven sand has abraded the surface, microscopic scratches accumulating into visible texture. Rainwater has dissolved tiny amounts of material, particularly in areas where runoff concentrated. Lichen has colonized some surfaces, the biological activity gradually breaking down stone at scales measured in geological time. Yet despite this weathering, despite the absence of maintenance for centuries, the structure stands. The fundamental engineering remains sound. Gravity holds the stones in place through sheer mass and friction. The architectural design anticipated loads and distributed them through stable pathways to the ground. Because the builders understood these principles and executed the construction carefully, their work persists long after the culture that created it has transformed beyond recognition. A bird lands on the uppermost stone, and you smile at the reminder that these monuments exist in a living world. Insects nest in the joints between stones. Plants grow in cracks where soil has accumulated. Small animals use the structures as landmarks and shelters. The stones have been incorporated into ecosystems, becoming habitat as well as historical artifact. The question of why these structures survive when so many others have not leads to consideration of intentionality and design. The builders chose durable materials, selecting stone types that resist weathering. They created stable geometries, avoiding designs that concentrate stress in ways that promote failure. They invested in foundations that go deep enough to resist frost heave and settling. Every choice reflected an understanding that this work was meant to outlast the workers who created it. You think about the modern experiments you participated in. The the stone carving and lifting and aligning. Those activities provided glimpses into ancient techniques, but they occurred in controlled conditions with safety equipment and the ability to stop if things went wrong. Ancient workers operated under different constraints. The work was genuinely dangerous, and accidents certainly occurred. Success required not just skill but also courage, the willingness to climb on unstable structures and perform tasks where mistakes could be fatal. The structures themselves embody accumulated knowledge from previous generations. No single builder invented these techniques. Each generation learned from predecessors, made small improvements, and passed the refined methods forward. The evolution of construction practices appears in the archaeological record as gradual changes in design, in tool types, in the scale of projects attempted. This intergenerational transfer of expertise is one of humanity's defining characteristics. As darkness approaches, you notice how the structure's profile stands out against the dimming sky. The geometry remains clear even as details disappear into shadow. This silhouette effect must have been intentional, chosen by builders who understood how their work would be perceived in different lighting conditions. Architecture is never just functional. It communicates through form and placement, creating meanings that shift with context and perspective. The stones around you were shaped before written language became common, before mathematics was formalized, before engineering existed as a distinct discipline. Yet the builders possessed deep practical knowledge, understanding gained through observation and experimentation rather than formal education. They knew how leverage multiplied force. They knew how to find true north using stars. They knew which wood made the best rollers and which stone made the hardest hammers. This knowledge was never lost. It merely stopped being actively used when newer methods proved more efficient. The copper saws and dolerite hammers and wooden levers were replaced by iron tools and mechanical advantage machines, and eventually by power equipment. But the underlying principles remained valid. You demonstrated their validity through direct experience, moving stones and carving channels using techniques that have not fundamentally changed in thousands of years. The cold night air settles in, and you prepare to leave. Tomorrow, other visitors will stand where you stand now, contemplating these same stones. Some will appreciate the engineering achievement, others will focus on artistic merit or historical significance. A few will invent fantastical explanations, because the straightforward truth seems insufficient to their need for mystery. The stones will remain regardless, patient and silent, continuing their slow accommodation with entropy. You take a last look at the structure, imprinting the image in memory. These stones were raised by humans whose daily concerns were probably not so different from yours. They worried about feeding their families, about their status in social hierarchies, about whether their work would be valued. The difference is that their labour produced something that survived, that continues to provoke thought and wonder long after the workers themselves return to dust. The path leads away through darkness, and you follow it carefully, aware that the ground is uneven and obstacles are hidden in shadow. Behind you, the stones remain, solid and permanent in ways that most human efforts are not. They will stand through tonight, through the coming seasons, through years and decades and centuries ahead. Other hands will touch their surfaces, other eyes will trace their lines, other minds will marvel at the achievement they represent. And perhaps, occasionally, someone will understand that the true marvel is not that the stones were moved or carved or aligned. The marvel is that humans chose to undertake these projects despite the enormous cost in labour and time, that they persisted through difficulties that would have justified abandonment, and that they created forms which speak across millennia to observers who do not share their language or culture, but who recognise in shaped stone a common humanity. The structures stand because builders intended them to stand. The techniques work because they respect physical law. The mystery evaporates when examined with informed curiosity rather than a predetermined need for the inexplicable. What remains after mystery departs is something more valuable: understanding of human capability, respect for ancestral knowledge, and appreciation for the patient accumulation of skill across generations. You reach the end of the path as full darkness settles. The stones disappear behind you, invisible now but still present, still enduring, still silently teaching anyone willing to learn. Tomorrow brings new opportunities to engage with ancient achievements, to test understanding against evidence, to refine knowledge through careful observation. The work of understanding continues, generation after generation, building on what came before while preparing foundations for what comes next. Sleep arrives easily after a day spent among stones, your mind filled with images of careful craft and patient construction. The rhythms of hammer on rock, the texture of rope against palm, the satisfaction of watching massive weight respond to lever mechanics. These experiences settle into memory where they will remain, accessible whenever you need to remember that humans have always been capable of remarkable things when motivation, knowledge, and persistence align. The stones rest under stars that ancient builders used for navigation and calendrical calculations. The same celestial mechanics that guided ancient construction projects continue their infinite patterns, indifferent to human interpretation but available to anyone who chooses to observe carefully. Understanding arrives not through revelation but through sustained attention, through the willingness to look past surface mysticism and engage with the elegant simplicity of physical principles applied by knowledgeable hands. And so, the structures stand, monuments not to lost technology or external assistance, but to human ingenuity operating within natural constraints, achieving remarkable results through available means. The stones remember nothing, having no capacity for memory, but they preserve everything in their joints and surfaces and alignments, offering testimony that can be read by those who learn the language of construction, the vocabulary of lever and abrasive and astronomical observation. You sleep, and the stones stand, and the world continues its rotation, and tomorrow brings new opportunities to learn from old stones what they still have to teach about patience, skill, and the remarkable things that humans can accomplish when they commit to long-term projects with clear vision and sustained effort. The Earth has always kept better secrets than stone tablets or papyrus scrolls. Long before museums and archives, people understood that the safest way to preserve what mattered most was to hide it beneath their feet, trusting soil and silence to protect knowledge until the right moment arrived. This is the story of those deliberate concealments, the things buried not to be forgotten, but to be remembered at precisely the right time. The jar feels cool against your palms even though the Egyptian sun has been beating down on this courtyard for hours. You're crouched in what used to be someone's home, maybe 1500 years before the Romans showed up to reorganize everything. The dwelling sits on the outskirts of Akhetaten, the city that will eventually be called Amarna by people who never knew its original name. Right now, in this moment around 1330 BCE, the place still hums with the particular chaos of a capital city that sprang up too fast and might not last much longer. Your knees ache from squatting in this position, but you're committed now. The jar you're holding is heavy, made from Nile clay that someone fired carefully enough to last. It's sealed with wax and linen, which seems excessive for storing grain or oil. Your neighbours have been whispering for weeks that the old order might return soon, that the priests who got pushed aside when Akhenaten decided everyone should worship his sun disk are sharpening their metaphorical knives. Change is coming, which means danger for anyone too closely associated with the current way of things. Inside this sealed jar are three things: a small statue of Aten, the sun disk deity that Akhenaten insists is the only god worth mentioning, a handful of hymns written on pottery shards because papyrus is too expensive for someone like you, and a bronze mirror that reflects your tired face when you peek inside one last time. These objects mean something to you. They represent the last 15 years of your life, a period when it felt like the divine might actually care about regular people instead of just aristocrats and priests. You know that opinion is about to become dangerous. The hole you've dug beneath your floor is deeper than necessary. You've gone down past the packed earth, past the layer of older debris, into soil that feels different, ancient somehow, untouched. You wrap the jar in linen, then lower it carefully. Your hands are shaking, which surprises you. You've buried food stores before, hidden valuables when raiders came through, but this feels different. You're not hiding treasure from thieves. You're hiding belief itself, preserving it for a future you'll never see. As you shovel dirt back over the jar, you wonder if anyone will ever find it. Part of you hopes they won't. These objects only matter to people who shared this particular moment. This brief window when the world seemed to tilt toward something new. 100 years from now, maybe 200. They'll just be curiosities. Broken pottery and tarnished bronze. The reverence will be gone, soaked away into the earth along with your intentions. But you pack the earth down firmly anyway, then scatter ash from the fire pit across the surface to make it blend in. You'll put a grinding stone here tomorrow, something heavy and utilitarian that no one would think to move. The secret will be safe, whatever that means. The irony doesn't escape you. You're preserving a religion that claimed to worship light and openness by burying it in darkness. But concealment has its own honesty. You're admitting that some truths can't survive in the open air of politics and power struggles. They need the Earth's patience, its willingness to hold things without judgment until conditions change. 3,000 years later, when archaeologists sift through this exact spot, they'll catalogue your jar as votive deposit or personal cult cache. They'll photograph the contents, analyse the clay composition, radiocarbon date the linen. They'll never know you knelt here with aching knees and shaking hands, making a choice that felt enormous in the moment but will register as a minor footnote in papers about daily life during the Amarna period. Your act of desperate preservation will become data. But right now, standing up and brushing dirt from your knees, you don't know any of that. You only know that you've done what you could. The rest belongs to time, that patient excavator that eventually uncovers everything. The manuscript weighs less than you expected, but then parchment never has much heft, even when it's covered in careful script. You're standing in the library of Lindisfarne Monastery, off the northeastern coast of Britain, in the year 793. Outside, the North Sea makes that endless rushing sound that you've gotten used to, but never quite stops noticing. Today the sound feels ominous, though maybe you're projecting. The prior came back from the mainland yesterday with news that makes your stomach tight. Ships with unusual sails have been spotted. Not the trading vessels you're used to, the ones that bring salt and metalwork in exchange for the monastery's famous illuminated books. These ships move differently, low in the water and fast. The messenger who told the prior about them had that particular pale look that means he's seen something he can't quite bring himself to describe fully. In your hands is a copy of the Gospels that took Brother Edfrith 3 years to complete. You've seen him working on it, hunched over his desk in light so carefully angled that it doesn't cast shadows across the page. The gold leaf alone represents weeks of work. Applying it requires patience that would make a stone carver weep. The illustrations in the margins contain more colours than you knew existed, and you've lived near this monastery your whole life. The decision to bury the book came from the abbot, but you're the one who volunteered to do it. Partly because you're young enough to make the trip up the coast without your knees giving out, and partly because you understand what's about to happen in a way some of the older monks don't want to acknowledge. Raiders don't come for theological discussions. They come for gold and silver, for anything that can be melted down or traded. A book like this, with its jewelled cover and gilt edges, looks like wealth. The fact that it contains the word of God won't slow anyone's axe. You've chosen a spot 3 miles up the coast, in a cave that fills with seawater during high tide, but stays dry in its upper reaches. It's the kind of place you explored as a child before you started helping at the monastery, back when the coastline was just a playground rather than a strategic consideration. The cave has a narrow entrance. You have to turn sideways to slip through, which means it's not the kind of place raiders would bother with. No storage space, no living quarters, nothing worth the effort. Inside, you've already placed the oiled leather wrapping that will keep moisture away from the parchment. The monks gave you their best materials for this task. They understand they're not just preserving a book, they're preserving hours of human attention, the kind of concentrated focus that borders on prayer. Every letter in this manuscript represents a choice. Where to thicken the stroke, how to shape the curve, which pigment to mix. Destroying it would be like burning years of someone's life. You wrap the book carefully, then place it in a wooden box that's been coated with beeswax. The box goes into a leather satchel, and the satchel goes into a niche in the cave wall that you've lined with stones. You stack more stones in front of it, arranging them to look natural, like they've always been there. A casual observer wouldn't notice anything unusual. You're counting on raiders being casual observers when it comes to empty caves. The work takes longer than expected. Your hands keep wanting to rush, to finish, and get back to the relative safety of the monastery. But rushing would mean doing this poorly, and the entire point is to do it well enough that the manuscript survives whatever comes next. So you slow down, check each stone placement, make sure the niche is completely hidden. The tide is starting to come in by the time you finish. You have to wade through ankle-deep water to get out, holding your shoes above your head and trying not to slip on seaweed-covered rocks. Walking back, you rehearse what you'll tell the abbot. The location is memorised. 3 miles north, past the distinctive rock formation that looks like a bishop's hat. The cave with the narrow entrance just above the tide line. You'll draw a map, hide it somewhere safe. The secret needs to survive even if you don't, which is suddenly feeling like a real possibility rather than abstract worry. The raiders come 2 days later. You watch from the hills as they beach their ships and move through the monastery with systematic efficiency. They're not random vandals. They know exactly what they're looking for, which buildings hold the most valuable items. The screaming doesn't last long. Monks aren't fighters, and resistance would be suicide. You see books being thrown into piles, probably to check for anything valuable tucked between pages. Most get left scattered in the mud. They're useless to people who can't read Latin. You survive by running, which makes you feel like a coward until you remember the manuscript hidden 3 miles up the coast. Cowardice with a purpose is just strategy. The prior told you that once, though he probably didn't mean it to apply to fleeing while your friends died. 1200 years later, someone exploring that same cave will find the box purely by accident. They'll be looking for smugglers' caches or natural artifacts, not religious texts. The manuscript inside will be water damaged and fragmentary, but enough will survive to make scholars excited. They'll marvel at the preservation technique, the quality of the materials, the skill required to create something so beautiful in such a remote location. They'll write papers about workshop practices and artistic influences. They probably won't think much about the terror that motivated the burial. History tends to sand down those edges, leaving behind clean narratives about cultural preservation and artistic achievement. The desperate scramble, the calculations about death and survival, the guilt of running while others stayed, those don't make it into museum placards. You just get credited with having the foresight to preserve an important artifact. But you didn't feel foresightful, stumbling through that cave with shaking hands and watching the tide come in. You felt terrified and small and painfully aware that everything you knew was ending. The concealment wasn't strategic. It was animal instinct dressed up as preservation. The manuscript survives anyway. Sometimes panic makes better long-term decisions than planning. The smell is what you'll remember later, even more than the fear. Smoke has a particular character when it's consuming books, something acrid and complex, like breathing in centuries of accumulated thought. You're standing in the courtyard of a private library in Cordoba, in what will eventually be called Spain, in the year 976. The Umayyad Caliphate is in one of its periodic upheavals, which means yesterday's acceptable scholarship is today's dangerous heresy. The library belongs to a merchant named Ibrahim, though ownership is becoming a complicated concept. Ibrahim himself left 3 weeks ago, reading political winds with the same skill that made him wealthy. He took his immediate family, his portable wealth, and about 20 books small enough to hide in saddlebags. Everything else, including you, his librarian, and the remaining 4,000 volumes, got left behind for someone else to deal with. That someone is you, which seems unfair but not surprising. You've spent 15 years organising this collection, creating catalogues, tracking down copies of texts that existed only as rumours. You know which shelf holds the only complete manuscript of a particular mathematical treatise. You know which corner contains poetry that would get people executed if the current regime found it. You know the value of every single item in this building, measured in both money and irreplaceability. The mob outside knows none of this. They know that Ibrahim was associated with the previous administration, and that's enough. They know this building contains books, and certain religious authorities have declared that most learning leads to corruption. They don't know that you've spent the last 3 weeks carefully selecting 30 volumes, not the most valuable or the most beautiful, but the most unique, and burying them in locations around the city. The jar hidden in the foundation of the abandoned mosque on the eastern edge of town contains 6 mathematical texts, including one on algebra that exists nowhere else in the Western world. The cache beneath the old Roman cistern holds poetry and philosophy, works that people might want to read again someday when politics shifts. Under your own floor, in a waterproof chest, you've placed the histories, chronicles of events that someone will eventually want to verify once the current passion for rewriting the past subsides. You didn't save everything, that would be impossible, but you saved something which feels simultaneously adequate and completely insufficient. Standing here now, watching smoke begin to curl from the library's upper windows, you're doing calculations about regret. Should you have taken more risks, hidden more books, found a way to smuggle them out of the city entirely? The thing about selective preservation is that it requires you to make impossible choices. Every book you buried meant abandoning 10 others. Every text you deemed important enough to save implied that others weren't. You've essentially declared yourself the arbiter of what future generations deserve to inherit, and the weight of that feels like it might crush your chest. The fire is spreading faster than you expected. The library's roof is wooden, and the summer heat has made everything tinder dry. You watch flames climb through rooms you could navigate blindfolded, consuming organizational systems that existed only in your memory. The section on astronomy goes first, 3rd floor, western corner, where the light was best for examining star charts. Then the poetry alcove, the medical texts, the collection of travel narratives that you loved reading during slow afternoons. Someone in the mob is shouting about cleansing corruption. The irony would be funny if it weren't so destructive. They're burning a repository of Islamic scholarship in the name of Islamic purity, destroying texts that scholars spent lifetimes creating and copying. But nuance doesn't survive contact with crowds. You learned that quickly over the past few weeks. The concealment you engaged in wasn't about preserving knowledge from invaders or foreign armies. It was about protecting thought from its own civilization. That's a different kind of burial, one that comes with its own particular shame. You weren't hiding from external threats. You were hiding from your neighbours, from people who share your language and religion and city. The enemy wasn't outside the walls. The enemy was the wall itself, closing in around ideas. 600 years later, someone will discover the jar beneath the cistern while doing construction. The books inside will be damaged but legible, and scholars will be excited to find texts they knew existed only from references in other works. They'll write papers about transmission of knowledge, about how certain ideas survived periods of upheaval. They'll treat your buried cache as evidence of cultural continuity. They probably won't think much about the selection process, about all the books that didn't make it into those jars. History remembers what survives, not what burned. The gaps in the record become invisible, filled in by imagination, or simply ignored as unknowable. Your agonizing choices about what to save will be hidden beneath celebration of what was preserved. But right now, watching the library collapse in on itself with a sound like the world cracking, you're very aware of the gaps. You know exactly which texts are turning to ash. You can recite titles, describe bindings, recall the specific shade of ink used by particular copyists. The absence has weight and specificity. It's not abstract loss. It's the destruction of particular things you knew individually. You'll carry that inventory for the rest of your life, a catalogue of everything that didn't make it. The buried books will feel less like salvation and more like inadequate memorial, a tiny fraction preserved to mark the magnitude of what was lost. But you'll tend them anyway, checking periodically to ensure the hiding places remain secure. Not because you believe they'll be found and appreciated, but because giving up on them would mean admitting the burning won. Sometimes preservation is just stubbornness with better planning. The jar in your hands is ordinary to the point of being boring. Brown clay, functional shape, No decoration beyond a few finger-pressed ridges around the rim where the potter's hand slipped while throwing it on the wheel. You're standing in what used to be your kitchen, in a village whose name will be forgotten, long before archaeologists assign it a catalogue number. The year is somewhere around 600 BCE, give or take a few decades. Nobody's counting precisely because counting years isn't something your community considers important. What is important right now is the fact that the jar contains something your grandmother gave you. A small bronze figurine, barely the size of your thumb, depicting a goddess whose name you don't know, but whose presence feels significant. Your grandmother received it from her grandmother, who received it from someone even further back. The chain of possession extends into time that nobody bothered recording. The figurine is old, older than anyone's memory, which gives it a particular kind of authority. The problem is that the village priest has been making speeches lately about proper worship and authorised deities. He's got backing from the regional temple, which has decided to standardise religious practice across several villages. Standardisation apparently means destroying personal shrines and family heirlooms that don't align with official pantheons. You've seen neighbours hauled in for questioning about their devotional habits, which would be darkly funny if it weren't so threatening. You're not particularly devout. The figurine matters to you because your grandmother's hands held it, not because you believe it channels divine power, but explaining that distinction to someone invested in religious conformity seems unlikely to end well. So you're doing what people have done for thousands of years. When official orthodoxy conflicts with personal attachment, you're hiding the evidence. The burial spot you've chosen is in the corner of what used to be your family's grain storage area, back when the family had enough grain to require dedicated storage. Now it's just a dirt floor and stone walls, but the corner still feels appropriate. You dig down about 2 feet, which is deeper than necessary but makes you feel more secure. The hole is wider than the jar by several inches, which lets you line it with clean sand before placing the vessel inside. Before sealing the jar, you take one last look at the figurine. The bronze has that greenish patina that old metal develops, and one of the arms is broken off at the elbow. In better light, you could probably make out details of the face, but the sun is setting, and you're trying to finish this before dark. You wrap the figurine in a scrap of wool cloth, not for any ritual purpose, just to keep it from rattling around, and place it in the jar along with a small clay lamp that also belonged to your grandmother. The lamp is less emotionally significant, but including it makes the cache feel more deliberate, less like you just buried trash. You have standards, even when hiding things from religious authorities. Sealing the jar takes longer than expected. You're using beeswax mixed with tree resin, heated until it becomes liquid enough to pour but not so hot that it cracks the clay. Getting the temperature right requires attention, and you're distracted by the sound of voices from the main path. Probably just neighbours walking home, but every sound makes your shoulders tense. You're not technically doing anything illegal. Not yet. But the space between legal and questionable has been shrinking lately. Once the wax sets, you lower the jar into the hole and begin filling dirt back in. Your technique is sloppy, motivated more by nervousness than care. You'll regret that later when you can't remember the exact location, but right now, you just want this finished. The dirt gets tamped down, smoothed over, and covered with loose straw to match the rest of the floor. An observer would have to look carefully to notice any disturbance, and you're betting that most observers won't look carefully. The concealment feels anticlimactic. You expected some sense of completion or accomplishment, but mostly you just feel tired and slightly ridiculous. You've buried a broken bronze figurine and an old lamp in a dirt floor. Future archaeologists will catalogue this as a ritual deposit or votive offering, inventing elaborate theories about your motivations and beliefs. They'll analyse the placement, measure the depth, compare the artefacts to similar finds from the period. They'll be wrong about almost everything. There was no ritual, no offering, no elaborate belief system at work. Just someone trying to keep family objects away from religious busybodies, using the oldest security system in the world. Putting things underground and hoping nobody looks there. 3,000 years from now, someone will indeed find your jar. They'll write papers about continuity of goddess worship, about how old religious practices persisted in domestic contexts despite official prohibition. They'll photograph the figurine from multiple angles, analyse the bronze composition, compare its iconography to regional traditions. The broken arm will be carefully noted in the condition report. What they won't know is that you barely remember which goddess the figurine depicts, that your grandmother told you once, but you weren't paying attention because you were young and immortal and couldn't imagine caring about family heirlooms, that the burial was practical rather than devotional, motivated by fear of harassment rather than religious conviction, that you were just trying to avoid trouble, not preserve sacred mysteries for future generations. But history has a way of upgrading motivations. Your pragmatic concealment becomes evidence of religious resistance. Your forgetting becomes deliberate mystery. Your ordinary clay jar becomes a ritual vessel. The gap between what happened and what gets recorded is filled with interpretation that makes everything sound more intentional than it was. You finish smoothing the floor and step back to examine your work. The burial spot is invisible, which was the goal. Whether you'll remember where you put it in a few years is questionable, but that problem belongs to future you. Present you is just relieved to have this finished. Tomorrow you'll go about your regular business, and probably nothing will happen. The priest's enthusiasm for standardization might fade once he realizes how much work it requires, or the regional temple might get distracted by some other issue, or maybe enforcement will intensify, and you'll be grateful for your paranoid afternoon of burial. The uncertainty is exhausting. You don't know if you've preserved something important or wasted an afternoon hiding garbage. You don't know if anyone will care, now or ever. You just know that the alternative, letting the figurine be destroyed or confiscated, felt worse than the effort of concealment. So you've chosen the Earth's patience over immediate clarity. You've bet on burial as preservation, on concealment as the highest form of honouring what came before. Whether that bet pays off is someone else's problem. Generations removed from this moment and all its mundane anxieties. For now, you have an invisible jar in an unmarked spot, a secret that might never need to be revealed. It's not heroic or dramatic, it's just practical magic, the everyday miracle of making things disappear by putting them where nobody thinks to look. The tablet is surprisingly heavy for something that's mostly clay and resentment. You're holding it in both hands, standing in what passes for an office in this provincial backwater of the Akkadian Empire, around 2300 BCE. The tablet contains administrative records, grain distributions, labour assignments, the kind of bureaucratic detail that makes empire function, but bores everyone involved in creating it. The writing is cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, then baked until the words become permanent. Permanent is a relative concept you're learning. The empire is fragmenting, which you know because tax collection has become sporadic, and the governor stopped showing up to meetings months ago. When central authority collapses, provincial archives become liabilities. Whoever takes over next might have questions about who supported the previous administration, who benefited from particular policies, who can be safely purged versus who needs to be co-opted. Your name appears in these records, not prominently. You're not important enough for that, but frequently. You distributed grain, assigned labour, collected taxes on behalf of administrators who are now conveniently absent. On some of these tablets, you're the only authority figure mentioned, which means when the new regime starts looking for people to blame or examples to make, your name will surface immediately. The sensible response would be to destroy the tablets entirely, smash them, grind them to powder, scatter the fragments so thoroughly that reconstruction becomes impossible. But you've spent 5 years creating these records, maintaining an accounting system that actually works, keeping track of details that more senior officials couldn't be bothered with. The tablets represent competence in a world that doesn't produce enough of it. Destroying them feels like erasing your own existence. So you're compromising. You're selecting the most problematic tablets, the ones that connect you too directly to unpopular policies, and burying them in a sealed room in the archive building's foundation. Not destroyed, but unavailable. Hidden from whoever conducts the inevitable purge of administrative records. The burial chamber is tiny, barely large enough to crouch in. It was originally a storage niche that got sealed up when someone built an addition to the archive. You've reopened it by carefully removing stones from the wall, working at night when the building is empty. Inside, you've placed wooden shelves to keep the tablets organised, because even in concealment you can't quite abandon your professional standards. The tablets you're burying tonight document grain shipments that bypassed normal distribution channels during a famine 3 years ago. You remember that situation vividly. People were starving, official channels were clogged with bureaucratic requirements, and someone needed to act quickly. You did. You authorised emergency distributions using authority you didn't technically have, then created documentation after the fact to make it look legitimate. It worked. People ate. Nobody died. Nobody even questioned your authority because you seemed confident and had official-looking tablets to justify your decisions. But those tablets could now be read as evidence of corruption, unauthorised resource allocation, falsification of records. Whether you saved lives or committed fraud depends entirely on who's reading and what they want to prove. You stack the tablets carefully on the shelves, organised by date and type of transaction. The temptation to add some kind of explanatory note is strong. A message to future readers explaining context, defending decisions, making sure your motivations are understood. But that impulse is stupid. Anyone finding these tablets won't care about your justifications. They'll either be looking for evidence to condemn you, or they'll be so far removed from this moment that context won't matter. The other tablets on these shelves document similar situations, decisions that made sense at the time but look questionable in record form, compromises necessitated by reality but unexplainable to people who weren't there, the gap between what happened and what got written down, then the gap between what got written down and how it might be interpreted. You're burying layers of translation failure. Once the shelves are full, you begin sealing the chamber. The stones go back in carefully, mortared with clay that matches the surrounding wall. You work slowly, making sure the repair is invisible. By tomorrow morning, this will look like solid wall, just another section of archive foundation. The tablets inside will begin their long wait for discovery, for reinterpretation, for whatever future makes of your buried bureaucracy. What you don't know, can't know, is that these tablets will remain hidden for over 4,000 years. The archive building will collapse and be rebuilt multiple times. The city itself will be abandoned, buried under windblown sand, forgotten so completely that even its name survives only in garbled references in other documents. Your carefully sealed chamber will be missed by the first wave of archaeologists, then the second, then the third. When someone finally breaks through that wall in the 1990s CE, they'll find your tablets in surprisingly good condition. Dry climate, sealed chamber, clay that was properly fired, all the preservation factors aligned. They'll carefully extract each tablet, photograph it in place, create detailed documentation of the fine context. They'll be excited because sealed archive chambers are rare and valuable. Then they'll begin translating the cuneiform and confusion will set in. These aren't the kind of records archaeologists expect to find hidden. There's no treasure, no royal correspondence, no religious texts, just grain distributions and labour assignments, the administrative minutiae of a small provincial office. Why would someone seal these up? What's significant about routine bureaucracy? They'll develop theories. Perhaps this was a time capsule, an attempt to preserve records during political instability. Perhaps these tablets were being protected from destruction by invading forces. Perhaps there's some kind of pattern in the records that reveals important information about economic conditions or social structure. All the theories will be wrong because they assume importance. They assume someone buried these tablets because they mattered, because they contained valuable information worth preserving. They don't account for the possibility that you buried them to make them disappear, to remove evidence of decisions that might get you executed. Concealment is self-preservation rather than cultural preservation. The irony will be invisible to future scholars. By hiding these tablets, you'll ensure their survival. The records that remained in open archives got destroyed or scattered centuries ago. But your buried evidence of administrative improvisation will last longer than the empire it documented, preserved by the very attempt to make it vanish. You finish sealing the wall and step back to examine your work. The repair is clean enough that casual inspection won't reveal anything. You sweep away stone chips and scattered clay, restoring the area to its usual appearance of neglected storage space. Tomorrow you'll begin selectively destroying other records, the ones that can't be easily hidden but need to disappear. It's going to be a long week of careful arson and strategic memory loss. But tonight, you've done what you can. You've created a gap in the record, a space where your most questionable decisions can hide from immediate consequences. Whether that space eventually becomes discovery or remains permanent concealment isn't something you can control. You've just pushed the problem forward in time, trusting that distance will provide safety. The Earth accepts your bureaucracy without judgment. Soil doesn't care about grain distributions or administrative authority. It just holds things, patient and indifferent, until someone decides to look. You're betting that nobody will, or at least that by the time they do, the context will be too distant to matter. It's not a perfect plan, but perfection stopped being an option when the Empire started collapsing. Now you're just trying to survive with minimal consequences, using the oldest strategy available, making yourself invisible by putting your evidence underground. The pot you're wrapping in old cloth is ugly even by utilitarian standards. It's lumpy, unevenly fired, decorated with patterns that suggest the potter had seen better work but couldn't quite replicate it. You're packing it anyway because ugly pots are still useful, and you're about to leave this village without much opportunity to be selective about household goods. The year is around 900 CE, somewhere in what will eventually be called Peru, in a valley system that supports your community through a combination of farming and stubbornness. The reason for leaving is tedious. There's drought. There's political pressure from the growing Wari state. There's internal disagreement about how to respond to both problems. The details don't matter as much as the result, which is that about half the village is relocating to a valley further south, where cousins have agreed to share resources. You're going with them, which means abandoning the home your family has occupied for at least 3 generations. Abandonment requires decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. The useful goes with you. Tools, seeds, textiles, anything valuable or necessary. But there's a category of objects that exist in the gap between useful and disposable. Things that have meaning but no practical function, or objects that are functional but too heavy to carry, or items that represent time and effort but not enough value to justify the space they'd occupy in your limited baggage. Your ugly pot falls into this category. It was made by your daughter when she was first learning pottery, back before she got sick. She's been dead for 2 years now, which is long enough that the grief doesn't ambush you constantly, but recent enough that her absence still creates holes in your daily routines. The pot is a clumsy record of her hands learning a craft, of afternoons spent working clay while you prepared food nearby. Taking it would mean carrying extra weight for purely sentimental reasons. Leaving it would mean abandoning one of the few tangible connections to those afternoons. The compromise you've arrived at is burial, not destruction, but removal from circulation. You're going to cache certain objects in locations around the abandoned village, hidden well enough that casual scavengers won't find them, but marked carefully enough that you could theoretically return someday and retrieve them. Theoretically. You know you're probably never coming back. But the pretense of possible return makes the burial feel less permanent than abandonment. The spot you've chosen for your daughter's pot is in the storage room of your house, in a corner where water damage has already weakened one wall. You dig down about 18 inches, which is easier than expected because the floor here is mostly filled from previous constructions. The village is old enough that you're digging through layers of other people's refuse and rebuilding. Someday your layer will be someone else's fill dirt, if there's anyone around to do building. You place the pot in the hole without ceremony. Adding ritual would make this feel too much like burial, and you're trying to maintain the fiction that this is just temporary storage. The cloth wrapping will help protect against moisture, though honestly the pot is already so poorly fired that a little water damage won't make much difference. You add a few other items to the cache. A broken grinding stone that your grandmother used, a ceramic whistle that doesn't work properly anymore, a chunk of pyrite that your daughter collected because it was shiny. None of these objects have monetary value. None would be worth stealing. They're personal in the most private sense, meaningful to you specifically, useless to anyone else. But combined, they represent the texture of your life in this place. The small accumulations that make a house feel inhabited rather than just occupied. Filling in the hole feels more final than you expected. Each handful of dirt is a small burial, a minor ending. You work slowly, partly because you're tired and partly because rushing would feel disrespectful to the objects below. When the floor is level again, you scatter ash and pottery shards across the surface to blend the disturbed area into its surroundings. Tomorrow, when you leave, this corner will look like any other part of an abandoned room. The thing about burying objects nobody wants is that they tend to stay buried. There's no incentive for treasure hunters or looters to dig through old houses looking for broken pottery and used grinding stones. Professional excavators might find them eventually, but only if they're systematic about excavation, treating every layer and feature with equal attention regardless of obvious value. 1400 years later, someone will indeed excavate this corner of your house. They'll be part of an archaeological survey documenting abandoned settlements in the valley system. Your cache will be notable primarily for being intact. Most of the rooms in the village show signs of disturbance from later occupation or animal activity, but this corner with its water-damaged wall was apparently too unpleasant for anyone to bother with. The excavator who finds your pot will recognise immediately that it's not a masterwork, but they'll also recognise that it's handmade, probably by someone learning the craft. They'll catalogue it carefully, note its find spot, analyse the clay composition. The other items in the cache will receive similar attention, measured, photographed, added to the site database. Then comes interpretation, which is where things get speculative. The excavation report will suggest this cache might represent a ritual deposit, possibly related to household abandonment practices. The combination of broken tools and personal items suggests intentional placement rather than casual discard. Perhaps this was an offering to ensure safe departure, or a way of maintaining spiritual connection to an abandoned dwelling. They'll be overthinking it. You weren't performing ritual. You weren't maintaining spiritual connections. You were just sad and reluctant to throw away your daughter's pottery. The burial was emotional management, not religious practice. But archaeology has trouble with ordinary sadness. It's not dramatic enough to explain carefully placed deposits. So emotional management gets upgraded to spiritual practice. Private grief becomes cultural pattern. The misinterpretation doesn't really matter. Your cache will be preserved and documented regardless of whether scholars understand your motivations. The objects will end up in storage at a research facility, available for future study. Your daughter's ugly pot will outlast the drought that drove you away, outlast the empires that rose and fell in this valley, outlast memory of the language you spoke while wrapping it in cloth. All because it was worthless enough that nobody bothered to dig it up looking for treasure. That's the accidental genius of burying things nobody wants. They survive through neglect rather than intention. The valuable items get found and removed. The obvious treasure gets looted. But the ordinary objects, the ones with only personal significance, stay buried simply because nobody has a reason to look for them. They wait patiently underground, protected by their own lack of value, until someone decides to excavate systematically rather than selectively. You finish covering the cache and stand up, brushing dirt from your hands. The room looks the same as it did an hour ago, abandoned, water-damaged, not worth anyone's attention. Perfect camouflage for objects that only matter to one person. Tomorrow you'll walk away from this place, heading south with your remaining possessions and diminishing hope. But part of your life will stay here, buried in a corner that nobody will care about for over 1,000 years. It's not the legacy you would have chosen, but it's the one you get, preservation through insignificance, survival through obscurity. The earth keeps better secrets when nobody's looking for them. The gold mask catches lamplight in a way that makes your eyes hurt. You're standing in a tomb chamber that's been carved out of bedrock somewhere in what will eventually be called the Mycenaean world, around 1300 BCE. The chamber is small but carefully finished, walls smoothed and plastered, floor level despite the slope of the hill above. In the centre, on a stone platform, lies someone important. Important enough for a gold death mask. Important enough for a tomb that required weeks of labour to prepare. You're here because you're one of the craftspeople responsible for finishing the tomb. Not the main architect or the goldsmith who created the mask, but one of the workers who smoothed the walls, sealed the floor, installed the door mechanism, the technical labour that makes grand gestures possible. Tomorrow the tomb will be sealed permanently, the door blocked with stones and plastered over, the entrance concealed to prevent robbery. Tonight is your last chance to see the work complete. The deceased's personal effects are arranged around the platform. Weapons, pottery, jewellery, a few items that suggest religious significance. Standard burial goods for someone of rank. What's not standard are the other objects in the chamber, tucked into corners and niches, things that weren't mentioned in the official funerary plan. Someone, probably several someones, has been adding items to the tomb without authorization. You notice a clay tablet with what looks like accounting records, a bronze tool that's clearly been used for leatherworking, a small statue that doesn't match the regional style. These aren't burial goods in the traditional sense. They're hiding. Someone is using this tomb as a secure storage location, counting on the fact that sealed tombs don't get opened unless loot has breached them. The impulse to add something of your own is sudden and hard to resist. You've got a small bronze chisel in your tool bag, one you've been using for the detail work on the walls. It's a good chisel, well balanced, comfortable in your hand after months of use. But it's also potentially evidence that you were here, that you had access to elite spaces, that you possess skills which might be valuable or dangerous depending on who's asking. The political situation has been unstable lately. The kingdom is dealing with succession disputes and external pressure from groups the officials dismissively call sea peoples, though that phrase seems to encompass anyone arriving by boat looking for new places to settle. Instability creates opportunity but also risk. Skilled workers like you become valuable during construction booms and expendable during contractions. Your name is on employment records, tied to projects that might become politically problematic. Burying the chisel in this tomb would remove that evidence from circulation. It would also preserve a small piece of your working life, though that motivation feels secondary to the practical concern of making certain objects disappear. You wrap the chisel in a scrap of wool, then tuck it into a niche in the wall, behind the pottery that was officially placed there. Anyone opening the tomb would need to remove multiple items to reach your hidden addition. The concealment takes about 3 minutes. You're practiced at making yourself useful without being noticed, which is a survival skill for workers in royal contexts. When you leave the tomb chamber and help seal the door, you're confident that nobody saw you add an unauthorized burial good. The chisel will stay there, forgotten and invisible, until some future moment when the tomb gets opened. That moment comes about 3,000 years later, when archaeologists excavate the tomb as part of a systematic survey of Bronze Age burial practices. The opening of the sealed door is documented photographically, every step measured and recorded. The initial discovery of the gold mask creates immediate excitement. Intact elite burials are rare enough to be significant. Then comes the detailed cataloguing of grave goods, and confusion begins to set in. Why is there a tablet with accounting records in a burial context? Why does the tomb contain working tools alongside ceremonial objects? Why are some items clearly damaged or worn while others appear to be unused? The assemblage doesn't match expected patterns for elite burial. The excavators develop theories. Perhaps this tomb was reused, opened and refilled at a later date with mixed deposits from different periods. Perhaps the burial goods represent a cross-section of the deceased's life, including their administrative role and craft patronage. Perhaps there's some ritual significance to including damaged tools alongside pristine ceremonial items. Your bronze chisel gets catalogued as a burial good, analysed for metallurgical composition, compared to other bronze tools from the period. Someone writes a paper about craft production and elite patronage, using your hidden chisel as evidence that the tomb's occupant had direct connections to metalworking workshops. The paper's conclusions are entirely wrong, but they're published in a respectable journal and cited by other researchers. The misunderstanding is complete. Your act of concealment, hiding a tool to remove evidence of your access, becomes interpreted as reverent burial, as intentional inclusion in funerary assemblage. The tomb accidentally becomes a time capsule because multiple people used it as a hiding place, each concealing items for reasons that had nothing to do with honouring the deceased. The funny part, which you'll never know, is that the deceased probably wouldn't have minded. Elite tombs were always partially fiction, carefully staged presentations of status and power that may or may not have reflected the person's actual life. Adding random hidden objects just makes the fiction more complex without fundamentally changing it. The tomb was already a performance. You just added some unauthorized props. But that's the thing about burial contexts. They're supposed to be permanent and sealed, which makes them paradoxically attractive for temporary concealment. People hide things in tombs counting on the fact that disturbing the dead is taboo. They don't account for future generations who treat ancient tombs as historical artifacts rather than sacred spaces, who open sealed chambers in the name of the knowledge rather than respect. Every systematically excavated tomb contains this tension. The original intention versus later interpretation, the planned assemblage versus accidental additions, the official narrative versus hidden realities. Archaeology catalogues everything with equal attention, which means your hastily concealed chisel gets the same scholarly treatment as the gold death mask that required months of skilled labour to create. Equal documentation doesn't mean equal understanding. The mask was meant to be seen and interpreted, designed to communicate specific messages about status and importance. Your chisel was meant to disappear, to exist in the space beyond interpretation. But burial equalizes everything. Underground, intention dissolves. Only the objects remain, waiting for someone to dig them up and assign new meanings that may or may not have anything to do with why they were placed there. You helped seal the tomb with the satisfaction of knowing your evidence was safely hidden. The irony that you actually ensured its preservation, that concealment in a sealed tomb is one of the best ways to guarantee an object survives for millennia, wouldn't have brought you comfort. You were thinking in terms of immediate safety, not long-term archaeological value. The tomb stands sealed for 3,000 years, holding multiple layers of concealment and intention, some planned and some accidental. When it finally opens, the archaeologists find exactly what they expected, an elite burial with all its associated complexity and ambiguity. They just don't realise that some of that complexity was people like you, using the space for purposes the architects never intended. Time capsules work best when they're accidents. Intentional preservation comes with explanatory notes and careful curation. But accidental time capsules, sealed spaces that accumulate unauthorized additions that become hiding places as well as burial sites, those capture something more honest about how people actually interact with sacred spaces. They show the gap between official function and practical use, between intended purpose and opportunistic adaptation. Your chisel sits in a museum storage drawer now, labelled and catalogued, part of an assemblage that scholars still argue about. The debates will continue because the evidence is genuinely confusing, a mix of intentional burial and hidden concealment that doesn't resolve into a clean narrative. That confusion is the most accurate part. It's the only thing about the tomb that truly represents the complicated, improvised reality of the world that created it. The manuscript in your hands is incomplete, and you did that on purpose. You're sitting in a workshop in medieval Paris, probably around 1200 CE, though the exact year matters less than the fact that it's several decades after the Albigensian Crusade finished destroying most of the Cathar communities in southern France. The workshop belongs to a bookbinder who doesn't ask questions about the texts he's hired to copy and preserve, which is why you're here instead of somewhere more reputable. The manuscript is a copy of theological writings from the Cathar tradition, not the main texts, which are already too dangerous to preserve, but secondary materials, commentaries, and letters that explain practices and beliefs. You've spent 3 months producing this copy, working from memory and fragments of partially burned documents that you salvaged from a house in Toulouse. The original materials are gone, destroyed by crusaders or their local allies, condemned to deliberate forgetting by ecclesiastical authorities. Your copying wasn't exact. You changed names, removed references to specific locations, edited out passages that seemed most likely to trigger prosecution if the manuscript was discovered. You also added ambiguity in places where the original was clear, creating textual confusion that might protect readers from accusations of heresy. The result is a document that preserves some information about Cathar beliefs, while deliberately obscuring other details. This is selective memory on purpose, preserving enough to maintain continuity while concealing enough to provide protection. It's also exhausting. Every editing decision required judgment calls about danger versus accuracy, about what future readers might need to know versus what might get them killed. You've essentially decided which aspects of Cathar thought deserve to survive and which can be safely forgotten. The bookbinder is preparing a special binding for the manuscript, one with a false cover that makes it look like a standard prayer book. Inside that binding you'll add additional concealment, blank pages at the beginning and end, innocuous prayers copied onto the first few folios, anything that creates space between casual inspection and the actual content. The manuscript will be buried not in earth but in plain sight, hiding among legitimate religious texts in the library of someone sympathetic to the cause. Plain sight burial is riskier than physical concealment, but potentially more accessible. A manuscript buried underground might survive indefinitely, but it serves no purpose if nobody can read it. A manuscript hidden in a library might be discovered and destroyed, but it might also be read and copied, creating new chains of transmission. You're betting on circulation over preservation, on use over security. The decision isn't entirely rational. Part of you knows that the Cathar tradition is effectively finished, that no amount of manuscript preservation will resurrect communities that were physically destroyed, but giving up on preservation feels like accepting the Crusaders' victory, like agreeing that certain ideas deserve permanent erasure, so you're creating this incomplete, edited, concealed manuscript as a form of resistance that you know is probably futile. The funny thing about selective memory is that the selections themselves become historical artifacts. 700 years later, when scholars finally gain access to the manuscript you're creating tonight, they'll recognise immediately that it's been edited. The missing passages will be obvious from contextual clues and grammatical gaps. They'll write papers about what was removed and why, developing theories about the manuscript's transmission history. Some theories will be accurate. Scholars will correctly identify that you removed names and locations to protect people. They'll recognise the passages where you added deliberate ambiguity to create interpretive flexibility. The textual analysis will be sophisticated and mostly correct about your methods. What they'll miss is the emotional weight of those editing decisions, the specific anguish of choosing which theological concepts to preserve and which to let fade, the guilt of knowing you're creating an incomplete record that will shape how future generations understand Cathar beliefs, possibly forever. The lonely certainty that you're probably the last person who knows what the original texts actually said, making you simultaneously preserver and destroyer. You finish binding the manuscript into its false cover and step back to examine the work. It looks innocuous, exactly as intended. Someone casually examining it would see a well-made but unremarkable prayer book, the kind of text that wealthy households commission as displays of piety. The hidden content is invisible without careful reading, protected by the camouflage of orthodox religiosity. Tomorrow you'll deliver it to the library where it will begin its long concealment. The librarian who accepts it will ask no questions, file it carefully among similar volumes, and forget about its existence. The manuscript will sit undisturbed for centuries, gradually accumulating the physical characteristics of age: brittle pages, faded ink, binding damage that will make later conservators nervous about handling it. Its content will survive not because of your preservation efforts, but despite them. Your careful editing and concealment will make the manuscript less interesting to potential destroyers, allowing it to hide effectively. But that same editing will frustrate later scholars who want access to the complete original texts. Your compromise between preservation and protection will satisfy nobody perfectly, which is maybe appropriate. Compromises rarely do. The selective memory you've created isn't false exactly. Everything in the manuscript is accurate as far as it goes, but it's incomplete in ways that matter, gaps that can't be filled because the sources no longer exist. You've created a deliberate amnesia, a structured forgetting that preserves some things by concealing others. Whether future readers will thank you or curse you for those choices is unknowable and probably irrelevant. You're not preserving for gratitude, you're preserving because the alternative, letting everything disappear without resistance, feels worse than creating an imperfect record. The manuscript might never be read by sympathetic audiences. It might be discovered by hostile authorities and destroyed anyway. But at least you tried. At least you didn't accept erasure without attempting preservation, however flawed. The concealment is complete. The manuscript exists in a state of simultaneous visibility and invisibility, physically present but intellectually hidden, available but not accessible, preserved but not complete. It's a perfect metaphor for selective memory, for the way communities try to maintain continuity through periods of violent suppression. You preserve what you can, conceal what you must, and hope that future circumstances will allow for more complete revelation. That revelation will never come, not really. The Cathar tradition will remain a subject of scholarly debate and historical speculation, known primarily through hostile sources and incomplete fragments, like your manuscript. The deliberate gaps you created will become permanent features of the historical record. Future understanding will be shaped by your editing choices, made in this workshop on a night when you felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of deciding what deserves to be remembered. But that's always how it works. Memory is selective not just because human brains have limits, but because preservation requires choices. What to save, what to risk, what to conceal, what to reveal. These decisions shape historical understanding more than most people realize. The past doesn't survive intact. It survives in edited form, shaped by individuals who made desperate compromises between accuracy and safety, between completeness and survival. Your manuscript represents one of those compromises. It's not heroic or particularly noble. It's just someone trying to preserve something while acknowledging that perfect preservation is impossible. The earth isn't the only way to bury secrets. Sometimes you hide them in books, protected by deliberate incompleteness and strategic ambiguity. The shovel hits something solid, and your heart sinks because you know what it means. You're standing in a construction site in what will eventually be called Beijing, in the year 1974, though you'd probably identify it as the 63rd year of something else, depending on which calendar system you are using. The construction site is supposed to become part of a water pump station, mundane infrastructure for a growing city. What it's become instead is the biggest archaeological complication of your career. You're not an archaeologist. You're a farmer who got recruited for construction labour because the work pays better than farming, and you're young enough to handle physical demands. Hitting solid objects underground should be routine. You found old foundations, bits of wall, scattered pottery and dozens of previous excavations. But this is different. The object you've hit is curved and smooth, and clearly not natural. More importantly, it's large in a way that suggests there are additional large objects nearby. You stop digging and call over the site supervisor, who has enough experience to recognise immediately that this is a problem. Within an hour, actual archaeologists arrive, bringing equipment and excitement and a bureaucratic energy that suggests your simple construction job just became complicated. By the end of the day, the site is shut down and converted into an official excavation. What you found, though you won't understand the significance for several weeks, is part of the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-size clay soldiers buried alongside China's first emperor over 2,000 years ago. It's one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and you found it by accident while trying to install water infrastructure. The excavation that follows is careful and systematic and takes years. Archaeologists document everything in meticulous detail, photographing each soldier's position, recording soil composition, analysing breakage patterns. You get to watch some of this, reassigned from construction to excavation support, moving dirt and helping set up equipment. The work is less profitable than construction, but more interesting, at least initially. What becomes clear as excavation progresses is that the army was buried deliberately, but discovered accidentally. The tomb complex was designed to remain hidden indefinitely, protected by earth and secrecy. The emperor's grave goods were meant to accompany him in death, not to be displayed in museums or photographed by tourists. The burial was concealment with no expectation of revelation. But time and political change undid those intentions. The dynasty that buried the emperor was overthrown relatively quickly. Records of the tomb's location were lost or deliberately suppressed. Centuries passed. The mound that marked the emperor's burial became just another hill, notable mainly for being artificial, but no longer connected in public memory to any specific burial. The terracotta soldiers underground became forgotten, their existence known only to soil and earthworms. Your accidental discovery transforms that concealment into exposure. Within months, the site becomes a major archaeological project. Within years, it's a tourist destination. The soldiers that were meant to remain forever buried are now among the most photographed artifacts in the world. The emperor's attempt at permanent concealment has been comprehensively defeated by a farmer installing water pumps. The irony would be funny if it weren't so complete. The emperor commanded resources that most ancient rulers couldn't imagine. Thousands of workers, years of labour, an entire industry of craftspeople producing clay soldiers. All that effort went toward creating a concealed tomb that would never be disturbed, and it worked, mostly. The tomb remained sealed and hidden for over 2 millennia, far longer than most ancient burials, but forever is longer than 2,000 years. Eventually someone expands a city, decides they need water infrastructure, digs in the wrong spot, and suddenly your secret is international news. The concealment that seemed permanent was just waiting for the right combination of technology and accident to breach it. Watching the excavation proceed, you start noticing details that the archaeologists find fascinating, but that strike you as sad. The soldiers were painted originally, but most of the paint flakes off almost immediately upon exposure to air. The preservation inside the sealed tomb was nearly perfect, but exposure to oxygen begins degradation within minutes. The archaeologists work frantically to document original paint colours before they fade, but they're racing against chemistry that they can't quite win. The soldiers were better preserved when buried. Discovery initiated destruction, or at least transformation. The very act of revealing them changed their nature from preserved artifacts to deteriorating objects requiring constant conservation. You've helped convert permanent concealment into permanent maintenance. The tourists who will eventually flood this site won't think about that trade-off. They'll see impressive ancient sculptures, marvel at the craftsmanship, take photos next to their favourite soldiers. The loss of paint and the ongoing conservation challenges will be invisible to casual viewers, mentioned maybe in small text on informational plaques that nobody reads carefully. The transformation from buried secret to public spectacle will seem like an obvious improvement. Of course, it's better for these artifacts to be seen and studied rather than remaining hidden underground. But you're not sure. The soldiers were doing fine underground. They didn't need to be found. The Emperor's concealment strategy was actually working. Your discovery didn't rescue them from obscurity. It interrupted a preservation technique that was successfully maintaining them for millennia. You've essentially destroyed a system that worked in order to implement one that requires constant intervention. The archaeologists don't talk about it this way. They're excited about the information revealed, about insights into Qin dynasty military organization and artistic practices. The discovery enables research that would be impossible if the soldiers remained buried. From that perspective, your accident was beneficial. It converted inaccessible information into available knowledge. But conversion costs something. The soldiers will never again experience the stable environment that preserved them so effectively. They'll be maintained, certainly, protected by modern conservation techniques and climate-controlled displays. But maintained is different from preserved. Maintained requires continuous effort, constant vigilance, technological infrastructure that might fail. Preserved just required being left alone. You're not an archaeologist or a philosopher, so these thoughts remain largely unvoiced. You go back to construction work once the excavation no longer needs manual labour. The site becomes a museum complex that you visit occasionally, seeing your accidental discovery transformed into tourist attraction. Each visit is strange, watching crowds of visitors photograph soldiers that you personally uncovered, seeing gift shops sell miniature replicas of artefacts that you held in your actual hands before the archaeologists arrived. The disconnect between the buried soldiers and the tourist attraction is complete. The objects remain physically the same clay, same faces, same swords, but their meaning has transformed entirely. They've gone from burial goods to museum pieces, from concealed secrets to public knowledge. The Emperor's intention to keep them hidden has been comprehensively overridden by historical accident, and that's ultimately what your discovery revealed. Not just clay soldiers, but the fragility of permanent concealment. No matter how much effort goes into hiding something, no matter how effective the concealment technique, eventually someone installs plumbing in the wrong spot, and suddenly your secret is displayed under museum lights. Time defeats all burial, given enough patience and accidental excavation. The Emperor probably wouldn't be happy about this outcome. He went to considerable trouble to ensure permanent concealment, using strategies that were sophisticated for their time. But he couldn't account for political collapse, for dynasties ending, for cities expanding over former burial grounds, for technologies he couldn't imagine being used by people who didn't care about his intentions. You destroyed his secret by accident with a shovel and a water pump project. The elaborate concealment that took years to construct was breached in an afternoon by someone who had no idea what they were uncovering. And now those soldiers stand in climate-controlled halls, stared at by millions of tourists, their paint mostly gone and their purpose entirely transformed. The Earth kept the secret well. It was people who couldn't leave it alone, and so the buried things eventually surface, transformed by time and discovered by accident, their original purposes obscured by layers of soil and interpretation. The secrets that people carefully concealed, from religious persecution, political upheaval, personal grief, administrative convenience, become archaeological data, museum displays, scholarly debates. The act of burial preserves but also transforms, changing private meanings into public artifacts, turning desperate concealment into celebrated discovery. You've walked through different centuries, different motivations, different outcomes, but the pattern remains consistent. People bury things when they can't protect them openly, trusting the Earth's patience over human uncertainty. Sometimes the concealment works permanently. Sometimes it works until someone accidentally breaks through. Either way, the buried object exists in a suspended state between intention and discovery, waiting for someone to decide its fate through deliberate search or random excavation. The Earth doesn't judge these concealments. It just holds them, patient and indifferent, until the weight of time or the curiosity of strangers brings them back to light. And in that patient holding, sometimes things survive that never would have lasted in the open air of their own time. The paradox of burial, that hiding can preserve better than display, remains as true now as it was when people first thought to place valuable objects beneath their feet and trust soil over neighbours. The secrets are still there, in thousands of locations, waiting for their own accidental discoveries or remaining permanent in their concealment. Each one represents someone's calculation about danger and preservation, about what deserves to survive and what protective methods might work. The buried truths outnumber the discovered ones by orders of magnitude. Most secrets stay secret. We only hear about the ones that resurface, which creates a misleading impression about the success rate of concealment. But lying there in comfortable darkness, you can appreciate the elegance of Earth's archive. It doesn't require maintenance or passwords. It doesn't judge content or worry about relevance. It just accepts what it's given and holds it until someone decides to look. That's better than most security systems humans have invented. And it's been working since people first recognized that sometimes the best way to preserve something is to make it invisible for a while, or forever, depending on who's asking and what they're looking for.